Thank you so much for coming today to this discussion, the topic of which is the liberal world disorder, reflections on grand strategy and not so grand assumptions. The occasion is the publication of two great new books, one by John Mearsheimer to my left. John is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. His book is called The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. And then to his left is Stephen Walt, whom you all know, who is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs. And there's his book, The Hell of Good Intentions, American Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. I am Jack Goldsmith, a professor at the law school. I'll be having some comments after John and Steve speak, and then so will Kathryn's going to go before me, Kathryn Sikkink, who is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the Carol Forsheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I think you all know who at least these three are, so I'm not going to elaborate on their credentials, and we're just going to get started with each of us going to speak for about 10 minutes. And I think, which one of you two want to go first? I'm Steve.
Hi, everybody. John and I have each written these books that are very critical of recent American foreign policy, and especially the attempt to spread liberal values. It is a complete coincidence that they're appearing at about the same time. We did not, in fact, plan it this way. And the two books come to the same conclusions, but by very different paths, and I'll say a little bit about that. So a common theme in both books is that recent American foreign policy, say since the end of the Cold War, has been largely a failure. And the easiest way to see that is sort of compare the world of 1993 and what we thought was going to happen with the world that we see today. Back in the 90s, the United States is on good terms with almost all the major powers, including Russia and China. Democracy is spreading rapidly worldwide. Iraq has been disarmed. Iran has no nuclear centrifuges. North Korea's nuclear program has been capped, or so we thought. Globalization is proceeding apace. NATO and the EU are expanding. Democracy, as I said, is spreading. The Oslo Accords mean we're about to have peace in the Middle East. The American economy is doing well, and the American military seems invincible. That's the 90s. Today, China's power and ambitions have risen. Russia has seized Crimea. Relations with Russia now worse than at any time since the Cold War. Russia and China colluding actively. Democracy is in retreat. According to Freedom House, 2017 marked the 12th consecutive year of a decline in global freedom. And in fact, the Economist's Democracy Index downgraded the United States last year from a full to a flawed democracy. That was the United States. North Korea, India, and Pakistan have all tested nuclear weapons and expanded their arsenals. Repeated efforts to broker peace in the Middle East have all been humiliating failures. The United States gets attacked on September 11th. We respond by invading Afghanistan and Iraq and launching a global war on terror, costing trillions of dollars, fueling extremism and weakening our position. And the U.S. military no longer seems quite so unstoppable. Much of the Middle East is in flames, and American interference has helped create failed states in Libya, Yemen, and Syria. So back in 2016, when Donald Trump said American foreign policy was a complete and total disaster, a lot of Americans nodded their heads and said, yeah, that sounds about right to me. And Hillary Clinton, by the way, couldn't respond with a long list of big successes, because there weren't any. So the taproot of these failures, we both argue in these books, it was the American commitment to a strategy of liberal hegemony, sees the United States as the indispensable nation that can spread liberal values around the world. But just to emphasize, this is a highly revisionist grand strategy. This is not a status quo strategy. We're not just defending our territory or upholding the balance of power in a couple of key areas. We're actively trying to change the status quo in many parts of the world. So why did the United States do this? Well, part of the reason is because we could. We were in such a position of power, wealth, and security. We could afford to try something like this. But there's still a puzzle there because we were already in great shape. So why did we feel like we had to go out and try and remake the world? And we have different explanations for that. And I'm going to give you mine, and then John will give you yours. They're complementary, but they're distinct. I argue we did it because the foreign policy elite was essentially strongly committed to this in both parties. And by the elite, I mean those individuals and organizations that work on foreign policy on an active basis pretty much 24/7. I'm talking about the blob, all right? So it's the formal institutions of government that do foreign policy, the presidency, the NSC, the Department of State, Defense, Treasury, etc. Membership organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, think tanks like the Brookings Institution, Carnegie Endowment, and lots of others. Special interest groups and lobbies that care about foreign policy, and there are dozens of these on lots of different issues there. Those parts of the media that cover foreign affairs, and yes, academics who write on foreign affairs, sometimes serve in government themselves, and train people who go into government service. Just a couple of things about this elite. There are no formal membership requirements. I say that even though some of you are trying to get degrees that you think qualify you. There's no required degree. There's no bar exam you have to pass. You need a license to sell real estate, but not to do foreign policy. All right. Second, it is a community where everybody knows each other. The leading members know each other pretty well. They belong to lots of the same organizations. When you think about it, because it's a community with no formal membership requirements, professional success depends almost entirely on your reputation and your connections. And that means there's a huge incentive to stay inside the consensus here. What is that consensus? Most of you know what it is. NATO is sacred. Iran, Russia, and now China are bad. The commitment to Israel is unquestionable. Nuclear proliferation is bad, but our nuclear weapons are good. Free trade is good. Terrorism is very bad. Spreading democracy and promoting human rights is good, except when our close allies fall short, and then we can give them a pass. And most important of all, the United States has to exercise active global leadership almost everywhere. We have to remain the indispensable nation. That's the consensus view. Now, there are sometimes tactical disagreements over particular issues like the Iran nuclear deal or intervention in Syria, but overall, people in the consensus support that basic worldview, support the strategy of liberal hegemony. Why does the blob like it so much? Well, partly because most people in it genuinely believe in those ideals. It's sincere, it's not purely instrumental. But also, an ambitious foreign policy increases their power and status, flatters their sense of self-worth, justifies a bigger share of the budget, and gives them lots to do. So somewhat cynically, I say liberal hegemony is a full employment strategy for the foreign policy elite. The American people, however, have a rather different view of all of this. They would like a more restrained foreign policy. In 2013, for example, 80% of the American people in surveys agree with the statement, quote, "We should not think so much in international terms, but concentrate on our own national problems and building up strength here at home." And consider that the last 4 U.S. presidents ran for office and got elected by promising to do less in foreign policy. Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. George W. Bush, I'll give you a humble foreign policy. Obama, I'll end those wars and rebuild our ties with other countries. And Trump, of course, does exactly the same thing in 2016. So how does the foreign policy elite sell a more ambitious foreign policy than the people want? 4 steps. Step 1, threat inflation. Long tradition of this, scare the American people so they'll think they have to get involved everywhere. Second, exaggerate the benefits. Liberal hegemony is supposed to bring stability around the world. Instead, we've been a principal source of instability. It was supposed to spread our values, but democracy, again, now in retreat, and it's the United States that's been starting wars, torturing people, doing things like that. Step 3, hide the costs of this policy. You finance the wars not by raising taxes, but by borrowing the money. You use the all-volunteer force, air power, to keep American casualties at an acceptable level. And you pretend that foreign opposition has really nothing whatsoever to do with American policy. It's not a reaction to what we're doing. It's just because others hate our values. Finally, step 4, don't hold anyone accountable. Consider that all of the people responsible for the Iraq War remain respected figures in the foreign policy elite, and some of them are in top jobs today. If you're a member of the elite, you can give classified information to your mistress, lie to the FBI about it, plead guilty, pay a fine, and quickly resume your position as a respected member of the establishment. You can be convicted of lying to Congress, get pardoned, go back into government, screw up again, and land a nice sinecure at a prestigious think tank. By contrast, those who challenge the consensus usually get marginalized even when they turn out to be right. So despite all of the sharp elbows you see in Washington, D.C., it's in fact something of a self-protecting community. And my final anecdote, and it's in the book, is what Larry Summers told Elizabeth Warren when she was headed off to Washington for her first term. This is what she says in her memoir. He teed it up this way: I had a choice. I could be an insider or I could be an outsider. Outsiders can say whatever they want, but people on the inside don't listen to them. Insiders get lots of access and a chance to push their ideas. People, powerful people, listen to what they have to say. But insiders understand one unbreakable rule: they don't criticize other insiders. After a quarter century, the recurring failures of those insiders helped bring us Donald Trump. Now, he said he would fix everything. Thus far, I think he's shown us mostly how not to fix American foreign policy. Let me stop there and turn this over to John, who will give you his own explanation for why American foreign policy has been doing so well. John.
Thank you, Steve. I have a different explanation than Steve does, but it builds on his description of what liberal hegemony is and how it has failed in all sorts of ways, certainly since 9/11. The key starting point is to understand that the United States is a thoroughly liberal country. And this is actually a wonderful thing. I thank my lucky stars that I was born in liberal America. It just doesn't get any better. But in a thoroughly liberal country, a country like the United States where liberalism is wired into the DNA, there's going to be a very powerful impulse to export that liberal democracy if the opportunity presents itself. And of course, as Steve said, with the end of the Cold War and the coming of the unipolar moment, we were in a position where we could ignore balance of power politics and we could do all sorts of social engineering around the world. And the key point is that what we wanted to do was remake the world in our own image. We wanted to create lots of little Americas. And therefore, the principal mission underlying liberal hegemony was to spread liberal democracy all over the world. And the Bush Doctrine was a really good example of this. So the question is, what went wrong? My argument is that to understand what went wrong, you have to understand the relationship between liberalism, nationalism, and realism. And my argument is that nationalism and realism trump liberalism at every turn. And when you pursue a liberal foreign policy, like liberal hegemony, you run into nationalism, which bollocks things up, and you run into realism. So let me take the rest of my time to explain to you how I think about the relationship between liberalism and nationalism, which is very important to understand, and then focus on the relationship between liberalism and realism, which is easier to understand. When you think about liberalism and nationalism, you have to ask a central question about human nature. And that question is, do you believe that human beings are fundamentally individuals who form social contracts? Or do you believe that human beings are fundamentally social animals who carve out space for their individualism? Now, liberalism is predicated on the assumption that human beings are individuals who form social contracts. They're first and foremost individuals. Liberalism is a theory or an ideology, pick your word, that focuses on the individual. This is why liberal theorists are referred to as social contract theorists. Nationalism, on the other hand, assumes that human beings are tribal from the get-go. From the moment you come out of your mother's womb, you are socialized in very heavy ways. You belong to a tribe. You belong to a group. In the world that we live in today, you belong to a nation. The question is, who's right? The answer is quite simple. nationalists are right in assuming that we are first and foremost social animals. It's very important to understand. We are not first and foremost individuals. We are born into social tribes. And that is the principal reason that nationalism trumps liberalism at every turn. Let me unpack this a bit more. If you focus on the individual, as liberals do, and you emphasize rights, inalienable rights, and you know how much we good liberals, and I put myself in this tribe, privileged rights, right? If you believe those rights are inalienable, and you're focusing on individuals, not tribes, individualism becomes universalism. Everybody on the planet is entitled to those rights. Okay? So what is hardwired into liberal hegemony from the get-go is this universal dimension that says people in country X have rights, people in country Y have rights, and we should think about as everybody being equal. Nationalism, on the other hand, which focuses on the tribe, on the group, okay, that ism emphasizes concepts like sovereignty and self-determination. So when you have a liberal foreign policy that engages in social engineering on the assumption that individuals all across the world are equal, right, and that you in country A have the right to interfere in country B, what you run up against is nationalism. You run up against sovereignty. You run up against self-determination. You know how Americans go ballistic when people tell us that the Russians are interfering in our election. Who are they to interfere in our election? We are a sovereign state, right? Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we don't want them interfering in our election, don't be surprised if those people in other countries are going to be upset when we interfere in their elections. Take this a step further. Most Americans don't understand it, but we are a very nationalistic bunch. And the foreign policy elite is filled with people who are infused with nationalism. We never talk about it. Think about Madeleine Albright, card-carrying liberal for sure. Her most famous statement is, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller. We see further." This is pure, unadulterated nationalism. We, as opposed to the other, that's nationalism. We are superior. We stand taller. We see further. We are the indispensable nation. We are the city on the hill. We are the chosen people. This is at odds with liberalism. Liberalism assumes you're all equal, all have inalienable rights. It's a universal dimension. Don't be surprised when the United States goes abroad. Here's the Bush doctrine, going into Afghanistan, going into Iraq, going into Libya, going into Syria, trying to interfere in the politics of those countries that people don't like it. They want to manage their own politics. We live in a world of nation states. Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. Just look at the globe. It's populated with nothing but nation states. Less than 50% of the states in the system are liberal democracies. This tells you nationalism is a very powerful force. And when you try and engage in social engineering, whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, or China, you're going to run into a lot of resistance. Just like anybody who tries to interfere in our elections is going to run into a lot of resistance. That's the nationalism versus liberalism story. The liberalism versus realism story is that the fact of the matter is the United States is remarkably powerful, and it is free to ignore the balance of power after 1989. But if you have countries like Russia and China in the system, which I would describe as major powers, those countries are going to pay very careful attention to basic realpolitik. Let me focus just on the Russians in my remaining 2 minutes here. The United States and its West European allies fought, in keeping with liberal hegemony, that it could take NATO, take the EU, and it could march it eastward right up to Russia's border. We also thought that we could foment democratic revolutions in places like Ukraine with the Orange Revolution, or in Georgia with the Rose Revolution. And we thought that the Soviets, that the Russians would not mind at all, because they would understand that we were a benign hegemon. We were not acting according to the dictates of realpolitik. And what we were trying to do was create a giant zone of peace in all of Europe, not just in Western Europe. So when you talk to somebody like Mike McFaul, who was the American ambassador to Moscow between 2012 and 2014, he will tell you that he talked to Vladimir Putin and his lieutenants, and he told them that they had nothing to fear from NATO expansion, because it was not aimed at containing Russia. I think he believed that, and I think that that was true. I think that the United States was not marching eastward for the purposes of containing Russia. That was the rhetoric we ginnied up after the crisis. That's not how we were thinking before the crisis, because we were thinking like good liberals. And the idea was that what we were doing was expanding those institutions eastward, expanding democracy eastward, right? And the end result of all this would be peace, love, and go. But of course, the Russians didn't see it that way. The Russians were deeply fearful of the idea that NATO, which had been a moral adversary of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, was marching right up to their doorstep. And Putin told McFaul on countless occasions that this is just unacceptable. And he was not the only one. Yeltsin said the same thing as well. And of course, what happened here is it all blew up in our face in February of 2014. And as a result, U.S.-Russian relations have gone down the tubes, which is not in our interest, not in the interest of the people in Eastern Europe, and not in the Russians' interest. And again, I think we had good intentions here. This is why his book is called The Hell of Good Intentions. We had good intentions. We were not bent on containing the Russians, but we didn't understand basic realpolitik. To go back to my first point, we also just don't understand nationalism, because we think nationalism is a foreign ism. As I tried to make clear when I talked about Madeleine Albright, and I could give you countless other examples. Think about the concept of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is American nationalism. Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. You run liberalism up against nationalism, you run liberalism up against realism, you get yourself into a whole heck of a lot of trouble. And I think that, in a nutshell, is why we are in a whole heck of a lot of trouble today. And by the way, it's why I think we have Donald Trump, or maybe put it differently, I think it's one of the reasons that we have Donald Trump in the White House today. Thank you.
Okay. So, in the current context, it is actually refreshing to deal with good, old-fashioned structural realists rather than patriotic.
He's not a structural realist.
I'm going to say good old-fashioned structuralists rather than patriotic nationalists. And you've just seen it shown here, right? A patriotic nationalist, my country, right or wrong, and a good old-fashioned realist is equally critical, if not more critical, of one's own country as of other countries. And so these books are strongest where they pierce the inflated expectations, hubris, and double standards of U.S. policymakers. And some of the policy advice they offer is very much needed, advice about the importance of restraint, prudence, awareness of blowback, and need for balance, okay? They correctly point that one big problem for U.S. policy is that it exaggerates the utility of military force. And they, this key point that both of them make about NATO really gets you thinking. And it's an essential realist insight that I learned, back from Bob Jervis in my entry political science class, and that is that we have to think about that other states too have legitimate security concerns. Okay, so I agree with part of their critique of U.S. foreign policy, having won the Cold War and achieved a position of primacy in the United States, could have and should have back on its global burdens, reduced security funding, and paid more attention to domestic politics in the United States. Okay, and I particularly share John and Steve's critique of the Iraq War, something I shared with them way back before the war began. Now, the books, as you've laid out, make similar arguments and then different arguments, and they do complement one another. John's is actually the more philosophical book, and Steve's is the more policy book. And John makes very important points, as you see, about the enduring power of nationalism, sovereignty, culture, and about the human tendency to believe in the superiority of its own nation. Okay, but I have a series of criticisms, and these criticisms, I may have thought, oh, we're going to invite a constructivist, because she'll, but my criticism is actually just pure old political science, old-fashioned political science criticisms, okay? And these are criticisms about method, about concept stretching, and about evidence. Okay, after years of being told by realists, we study what really is in the world and not what ought to be, we're faced with books that say 25 years of U.S. policy, what really is all wrong, and it ought to be the way we want it to be. Okay, so in other words, they're saying U.S. policymakers for 25 years haven't understood the way the world really is, but only our structural realist friends understand that, and so they need to teach U.S. policymakers the way the world ought to be. So I think you guys have to stop using this thing of saying we describe the world as it really is, not as it ought to be, because you're spending so much time telling us what ought to be. But more seriously, the method issue is this. The method they use is counterfactual analysis. Okay? It's a very common method in foreign policy analysis, but it's very problematic because what happened for 25 years in foreign policy is compared not to the past, but to what could have been, what might have been, to an alternative that these scholars envision. And both of them actually say quite clearly what that alternative is. That alternative is what other analysts hope for at the end of the Cold War, people like Francis Fukuyama, for example. Okay, so we have not just counterfactual analysis, but we have what I call comparison of the ideal. They say, let's compare what really happened to the ideals expressed by analysts at the end of the Cold War, and we'll show you how far we fall short from those ideals. Well, guess what? Whenever you compare to ideals, and this is something I say in my latest book, human rights people do it all the time. You compare to the ideals, you always get a yardstick with negative numbers on it. -1, -2, -3. There's no way when you're doing comparison ideal that you get any positive numbers. So I personally prefer to compare the present to the past and to empirical trends rather than using counterfactual analysis about what should have happened or to the hopes of what might have happened. Okay, so John's book is subtitled Liberal Dreams. But these books are partly realist dreams. Okay, and I would prefer to use data rather than realist dreams as a comparison. Okay, concept issues, concept stretching. So concept stretching is where a distortion occurs where the concept does not fit the new cases. And here, the biggest concept stretching is to act as though all three administrations analyzed here. So okay, both of these books agree entirely that there are no important differences between Clinton, between Clinton, Bush, and Obama. Okay, for their purposes, all the same, all liberal hegemons. Okay, now to me that is taking liberalism and concept stretching so far as to make liberalism meaningless anymore. And in particular, the concept stretching is particularly egregious when it's applied to the neoconservatives who led the George W. Bush administration foreign policy. Okay? Now, the neoconservatives took us all kind of by surprise, and we had trouble categorizing them at first. And my first step to categorize was to simply call them realists. They looked more like realists to me. They believed in...
You need to get out more.
No. They believed that national interest should take precedence over everything else. They believe we live in an anarchic world where peace can only be maintained through self-help, and they disdain and disregard the role of international law, international institutions. That looked to me like realism. I realized my fault. I was concept stretching. They weren't realists. Okay? They shared 3 or 4 important characteristics with realists, but they were different in part because they had this endorsement of the need to spread democracy and remake the world in the U.S. image. But I can realize they're not realists. But they certainly are not the same kind of liberals as we saw in the Clinton administration or in the Obama administration. And the attempt to act as though neoconservatives are ordinary liberals is one of the great flaws of both of these books. The first reference, and you say, no, we don't really do it. No, the first reference is found in Steve's book that discussed liberal and neoconservative proponents of liberal hegemony was page 69. Okay, so he doesn't even make the distinction until page 69. Later, almost in passing, Steve refers to various versions of liberal hegemony, and again, we hear about a more restrained democratic version and a more muscular GOP approach. But trying to shoehorn the neocons into a liberal category strains credulity. And in doing so, the authors then are able to spread the blame evenly against all the liberals, rather than focus on the glaring problem at the center of this narrative, which is the Bush administration's war in Iraq. I think most analysts agree, had Gore been elected, never would have happened. Okay, finally, I'd like to have seen a little more careful approach to the use of evidence, because it's all about success and failure, but the question is compared to what. I'm going to just show a few slides because I think it would have been useful to have a little more data about, we're talking about complete failure. Okay, so we want some data. What is this complete failure? We'd like to have data about U.S. trade deficits, global trade openness, overall trade volume, levels of democracy, levels of development, public opinion survey, etc. And I just want to throw up a few things. Why? Because the good thing about the books is they give you sometimes clear hypotheses and clear causal arguments, okay? That you can say, well, here's a causal argument, let's test it against evidence. And so John says, for example, that states that pursue ambitious liberal foreign policies end up making the world less peaceful. It's a causal statement. And that liberal unipoles soon become addicted to war. And so I just wanted to say this is, standard data on war. You see we have interstate wars, the green line, 1,000 battle deaths or more. We have wars, civil wars here with 1,000 battle deaths or more, the red line. And then we have armed conflicts. That's with 25 battle deaths a year. It's a very low threshold that we're starting to use now to talk about conflict in the world. Okay? But you see the height there, 1990, is the moment these books begin. They say, okay, at 1990, everything starts going bad. And we have these liberal groups that are making the world less peaceful. Well, objectively, the world has not become less peaceful since 1989. Okay? And so I think we have to say less peaceful than, yes, less peaceful than Francis Fukuyama thought it would be, but not less peaceful than the past. Okay, just so you say, there's other trends. You guys say, okay, wars are down, but genocide's up. Genocide is also down. We see the peak in 1980, 1970, 1990, down since then. In terms of human well-being, this is a Human Development Index. It is a combination of per capita income, education, and life expectancy. It tries to do a better measure of human well-being than just income, right? And this is just developing world regions, but it would be the same if we had the developed world as well. Human development is increasing in all parts of the world. And you see, again, you can see 1989 there. You can see there have been very, very important increases in human well-being in the world since the period where both these books begin. And finally, the democracy issue, because this is very important. This is polity. There's a lot of arguments about how we characterize democracy. There's many different databases. I'm going to show you three real quick. Okay, this is polity. You see 1990. That's the point where these books begin. That's where autocracies, authoritarian regimes, and democracies cross. Okay, and we get more. And so you see again this period that they're talking about is tremendous failure at everything we tried to do. We see an increase in democracy, a decrease in authoritarianism. Now, it's not simple, and Steve points to the Freedom House literature, and so I wanted to pull that up. And so, yes, you see between 2007 and 2017, there is a decrease in free countries in the world. Okay, so there's a worrisome trend here about a decline in freedom. But if we compare 2017 to 1997, or to 1987, which is the moment when both these books say that failure starts, we don't see a big failure trend here, even in terms of democracy. And finally, this is considered the best database on democracy these days, the VDEM database. This is their 2018 report, it's the most recent report. And there are very worrisome trends. I'm not denying any worrisome trends in the world. I'm just denying this, what Hirschman will have called fracasomania, which is a failure complex. Okay? And so even VDem says democracy is still in good standing across the world. Global levels of democracy remain close to their all-time high. But there are worrisome problems about this autocratization that we should not be complacent about. Okay, so just to end, because I know I'm running against time. Finally, I think both John and Steve confuse the means of foreign policy with the goals. Okay, so there's this assumption that if you believe, and you really said explicitly, John, I think, if you believe in democracy, you must believe in imposing your democracy on the whole world via war. And I think that's a flawed assumption. People can believe in democracy, people can believe in rights, and it does not follow. Certainly, most of the people in the human rights world that I know around the world do not believe that you should impose democracy or human rights through military means. Okay? I do think there is a foreign policy elite that believes that. Okay? But it was done in very different ways by the neocons and the other liberal regimes. And the neocons were much more indifferent to the role of international law and international institutions in that process. Okay? But one, I don't think we can assume that because you believe in rights, you believe in imposing rights militarily. And secondly, I don't think we should assume at all that the United States is the main force for imposing democracy and human rights in the world. The books read as if the United States stopped talking about democracy and stopped having a human rights policy, that all demand for human rights and democracy in the world would disappear. But the demand for human rights and democracy in the world began well before the end of the Cold War. The United States was sometimes on the right side, it was sometimes on the wrong side, it was sometimes on the sideline. And the process of these processes of increase of democracy and increase of concern with human rights are not only being led by the United States. So just to conclude, let me say that I think these are both purposefully provocative books. They make big counterintuitive claims. They are the kind of books that get attention because actually the academic policy world enjoys counterintuitive arguments that are different and fresh. And these, as you saw, are. We saw this week, for example, that Steve's book already got pre-publication publicity in the news analysis part of the New York Times, something most of us would kill for. And so there's no doubt that they will generate attention as they are meant to do. And I believe that these books it's useful to have these books to challenge groupthink and receive wisdom. But we need to hold them too, as one always tries to do, to our standard scholarly criteria about methods, concepts, and evidence. Thank you.
Okay, I'm a little more sympathetic to your books. But I have some questions. And just have a few, and then we'll turn it over to questions, and the questions will take place over there. So I'm just wondering, I think the causal claim in the book is that foreign policy disasters after the end of the Cold War are results to the commitment to liberal internationalism, which became liberal hegemony in the unipolar world. I think that's one way of summarizing the claims of both books. So everything you call liberal internationalism is arguably a core part of U.S. foreign policy beginning at the end of World War II. Commitment to spreading democracy, commitment to international institutions. The United States often invoked human rights concerns. There was lots of intervention to try to change their governments. It all took place in a Cold War context, in a balanced power context, in a world of bipolar conflict. There was a blob then. There was certainly a foreign policy elite. There was a conventional wisdom about the foreign policy elite before 1989. And so one wonders, is the entire causal explanation for this dramatic change in policy that you're positing simply that we went from bipolar to unipolar? Because you have a lot of the same kind of activities before and after with some of the same rationales. So that's one question. Second question is, how do you tell what the motive, what the kind of driving rationale is? You use the language, you evoke a lot of the language of liberal internationalism. You cite leaders invoking the language of liberal internationalism for various interventions after the Cold War. But a lot of that was as pretextual as it was during the Cold War. We didn't go in, certainly when we went into Iraq and Afghanistan, the justification became state building, bring democracy. There were a lot of, as you document, truly misplaced conceptions of how we might change these countries in our image. But the places we intervened tended to have some kind of strategic rationale initially, however misplaced. But certainly Afghanistan, we went in for a reason because we were attacked from there. But there's a reason why we engaged in humanitarian intervention in Kosovo and not Rwanda. We had an important strategic interest there. So I'm wondering also, the second question is, how do you tell whether particular foreign policy events are, why are you so confident that it's only driven by liberal hegemony and it doesn't have mixed explanations? And how do you tease those out? I had the same set of counterfactual questions. You present a really rosy story about how wonderful the world would have turned out if we withdrew from NATO and didn't go into Afghanistan. And all of that may be true, but the opposite might be true also. It could have been that the Soviets, that the Russians would have been more menacing in East Western Europe. I tend to agree with your story, but I'm just wondering why you're so confident about your counterfactual. It could be that we would be suffering more than we are now from a terrorist threat. So I'm just wondering what you say to questions about what seem like rosy counterfactual assumptions. I also wonder whether another causal explanation for what changed after 1989 or 2001, wherever you want to look, is the technology of war. Because one of the things that's made a lot of our interventions possible, certainly not Afghanistan and Iraq, but just about every other one, is successful techniques for war from a distance where U.S. suffers basically no threat to its personnel, and yet it can inflict harm and achieve results on the ground. And that's a way of decoupling foreign policy from American attention, from democratic attention, because if soldiers aren't being killed, Americans care less. I wonder how much the availability of those weapons and increasing availability of those weapons inform our tendency to intervene on humanitarian or mixed humanitarian and other grounds. I wonder also, I found the books to be certainly complementary, very similar in some respects. They have different foundations. I'm wondering if you want to address, do you disagree about anything with regard to the post-Cold War, what's happened after the Cold War? And the last question is, does anything in the last 30 years that you document, the terrible foreign policy follies of the last 30 years, shake your confidence in the realist assumption that states are rational actors?
Those are great.
So I think now we're going to open it up, is that right?
Yeah, we should probably each take a very brief rejoinder. So I'll do just a couple. So my counterfactual, if you will, I don't think, by the way, that the books are entirely based on counterfactuals and things like that. Sometimes we don't just talk about the ideals, we talk about the actual predictions people made. If we do this policy, here's what's going to happen. And those predictions either turn out to be correct or not, and we point out, or at least I point out when they turn out to be false. But some counterfactual, I think if the United States hadn't done NATO expansion and had stuck with the Partnership for Peace, which included Russia, Europe would be as tranquil as it is today, and our relationship with Russia would be substantially better. I think if the United States had not adopted dual containment in the Middle East, which required keeping thousands of troops in Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda would have been less likely to strike the United States on 9/11, because that's one of the clear grievances that Osama bin Laden pointed to. I think if the United States had not bungled the Oslo peace process and actually gotten us to a two-state solution, that also would have reduced the anger at the United States and made 9/11 less likely. Of course, no 9/11 means no Afghanistan, so we wouldn't be still stuck in Afghanistan. I think not Gore as president, but rather no 9/11 means almost certainly no Iraq war, so several $1 trillion left in America's bank accounts, thousands of people alive as well. I think a more measured approach to globalization, something we haven't really talked about, but the enthusiasm with which we pushed globalization without realizing it was going to have some negative consequences and wouldn't necessarily deliver quite as much as it promised, would have helped as well. All of those, I think, rather plausibly leave the United States and the rest of the world in better shape. Yes, you're right. I think I, at least, emphasized the continuities across these three administrations more than the differences. Obviously, there are differences, right? Both Clinton and Obama basically try to run liberal hegemony on the cheap. no ground troops, keep it as inexpensive. And Bush is the one who, post 9/11, does do the big roll of the dice in Iraq, which of course he thinks is going to be cheap. He thinks we're going to go in, knock off Saddam, get out, leave a nice, thriving democracy afterwards. But I'm really struck by the continuities across all of them. And Jack has written about this in the intelligence context. The similarities between Obama and Bush, second-term Bush, not first-term Bush, second-term, are really quite striking. And they're really dramatic when you consider that Iraq has gone south, Afghanistan is going south, and we've had a major financial crisis. And Obama is about as different a president from George W. Bush as you can possibly imagine. Different party, and he comes in and does all of the same sorts of things, like sending more troops to Afghanistan, like knocking off Muammar Gaddafi, right? Like continuing to push the development of ties in Eastern Europe, as John described, and of course, continuing the entire counter-terror program minus torture, right? But everything else pretty much stays in.
By the end of second-term Bush also.
Right, fine. So the continuities are there. The style is completely different. Obama is completely different in that regard, but the continuities are there. With respect to Jack's question, there's some continuities since World War II. I do think, and here's the structural realist in me coming to the fore, that the United States is largely unconstrained after 1993-94. If somebody had proposed invading Iraq in 1985, when the Cold War was still underway and Iraq was a nominal Soviet ally, that idea would have lasted 15 seconds in Washington. Are you trying to start World War III? Someone would have said, and the idea would have died. In 1995, when the idea first begins to surface, it can retain life. The people advocating it are not ruled out of court, and eventually, when the stars line up, it actually happens. Finally, I think your point about technology is right. As I say in the book, and I try to allude here, one of the ways we've tried to do this by keeping the costs as low as possible or hiding them as much as possible. If we had a draft, it wouldn't be easy to do this, it seems to me, as well. But there's a paradox in here, right? When you fight wars like the war in Afghanistan, and you are so casualty sensitive, and you know that you can't suffer a lot of lives lost, it turns out you can't win them either. Right? You can keep them going forever, but you just can't win, and eventually the public gets tired of them anyway, does realize that you're spending billions of dollars every year, even though it's kind of disguised in supplementals and things like that. So it does have some consequences. My last point is, has this shaken my faith in the rational actor assumption? Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean, I am struck again. My book is not a structural realist book when you think about it. I'm talking about the nature of the domestic foreign policy elite. But I do think, and this is that we have been in such a favorable geopolitical position, powerful, wealthy, isolated from other major powers, etc., that we're allowed to be stupid and get away with it. This is just the confirmation of Bismarck's famous alleged quip that there is a special providence that looks after fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. And I'm grateful for that, but I'd like us to do better anyway.
Very quickly, I'll be much shorter than Steve.
That's what we disagree on.
Just to Kathryn, she put up the number of wars that we have seen in the system over time. And you also put up a slide that had the number of democracies, whether they're increasing or decreasing. I think that doesn't capture the essence of what our book is about, or our books are about. Our books are about U.S. foreign policy. They're not about whether or not there has been more or less war in the system. And if you look at the United States has fought 7 wars since the Cold War ended. It has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since 1989. And as I say in the book, we are addicted to war, right? So I think that's the story we're telling. And the story you're telling is a different one, and it's an important one. And the same thing is true with regard to spreading democracy. If you're going to analyze America's record spreading democracy, what you have to look at first and foremost is the Bush Doctrine and what we tried to do in the greater Middle East, because that was our great attempt to spread democracy. And there I think we were a failure. And I would note that you pointed out, and I'm with you 100% on this, that it's not like you need the United States to have democracy. Other countries have all sorts of incentives to have a little bit of democracy. So therefore, I'm not terribly surprised that liberal democracies may be increasing over a particular period since 1989, independent of the United States. But when the United States gets involved, and especially when it uses military force, this brings me to my final point that you made. You said that there are a lot of people who do believe you can spread democracy and not do it at the end of a rifle barrel. I think there are a good number of people like that. You, of course, are one of them. But the problem is that you're badly outnumbered in Washington by these people who want to spread democracy at the end of a rifle barrel. And if you go to the end of the Cold War and you look at Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece, which basically said that democracy is the future, and we've got the wind at our back, and you marry that with Charles Krauthammer's very famous piece, The Unipolar Moment, that says we have all this military power and we should use it for good purposes, i.e. the ones that Frank is describing, you're off to the races. And people like you and people like us are not going to be able to be more than speed bumps on the road. And I would note, just with regard to the run-up to the Iraq War, Steve and I and Shibli Talhami organized that famous ad in the New York Times. We spoke to lots of people. And people sometimes say that realists, that's a realist advertisement. If you go look at the names on that list, there are quite a few liberals, you know, in the IR sense of the term, who are on that list and who are opposed to the war, which I think gets to your point. With regard to Jack, I just want to respond to one point that he made, because I think it's a very important point. Jack says, if you look at Afghanistan and Kosovo, his belief is that we went into Kosovo for balance of power reasons or realist reasons, and at least in part, or good part. Yeah. And with regard to Afghanistan, what we were concerned about was terrorism. Al-Qaeda had been located there or was located there. And when we went into Iraq, for example, it was not only terrorism, it was weapons of mass destruction. And that certainly doesn't look like it has anything to do with liberalism. And I disagree with that. It's important to understand that what liberalism, what liberal hegemony wants to do is it wants to spread democracy all over the world. And once you spread democracy all over the world, because democracies don't fight each other, war is taken off the table, the terrorism problem is taken off the table, and the proliferation problem is taken off the table. So again, the Bush Doctrine was designed to create a sea of liberal democracies in the Middle East. It was liberal hegemony at its best, right? And it was designed to solve the problems that you described. If you go to the Balkans, right, in the Balkans, it had nothing to do with the balance of power. Who cares about the Balkans from a balance of power point of view? What the Balkans represents is kind of a southern expansion of NATO. It's trying to break those countries up in as peaceful a way as possible, and then integrate them into the institutions, turn them into democracies, get them hooked on capitalism. The same thing that you're doing as you expand NATO eastward. And it's really all part and parcel, I would argue, of liberal hegemony.
I've got some questions about that, but I'm not going to ask them now. Do you want to say something very quickly?
Just two fingers. I just put this data up, not making causal claims, but because hearing you and reading these books, the whole room would think that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And I just thought, either you could say, United States had unmitigated failure for 25 years, but various trends that they were trying to promote in the world nevertheless improved, but that was completely, the United States had nothing to do with those trends because we failed. Okay, I'm not making calls on this, I'm just trying to give a backdrop of data because the impression you give is of a worsening world on all of these development, democracy, human rights levels.
Just the places we've been actively involved. That's overstates.
So I think we're going to take questions at this microphone here. Is that correct? If there are questions, there must be plenty of questions.
I thought Madeleine Albright's most famous statement was when she was asked about the sanctions on Iraq, the genocidal sanctions that UNICEF estimated were killing an extra 5,000 Iraqis a month, mostly children. And she replied, "We think it's worth it." So sanctions certainly are an act of war as well. I'm really puzzled as why you would think there's a great difference between liberals and neocons in their reckless disregard for the lives of foreign nationals. Both of them care about protecting American soldiers, but both of them seem to be equally indifferent to the effects on the ground for ordinary citizens in the countries, whether they sanction them or whether they deliberately invade them. And you have to also take into account that Hillary Clinton not only supported the sanctions, but she voted in favor of the war in Iraq. So I'm not really convinced that there's a great deal of difference between the Bush years and the bookends on either side of them as far as their lack of concern for foreign nationals and the impact of their foreign policy decision making.
You want to respond to that? Because
It wasn't directed at us.
So I've served in several of the countries.
Let me just interrupt for a second. I don't teach at the Kennedy School. Is your norm to identify yourself?
Yes.
Yes.
Please identify yourself.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Joshua Polachek. I just graduated from the Kennedy School, served in the State Department for 15 years in several of these unmitigated disasters. And
Thank you for your service.
I think I think back to your prescription of pulling back, and it seems like the problem in Afghanistan was that we, as soon as we won the Cold War, we forgot about Afghanistan. We probably could have stabilized the country with $50 to $100 million of development aid, as well as providing them air support against the Taliban during the 90s, and chose not to do that because peace dividend. And it also seems like the issue, Iraq was obviously a strategic blunder, but it was a strategic blunder compounded by tactical mistakes. We sent in, at the peak time of the surge, we had 1/3 the number of troops in Iraq that we had in Kuwait, which is 1/32nd the size, population and size-wise. We weren't doing it correctly. So even if we had this great idea, we weren't even tactically executing it well. And so I'm wondering, on one side you say, well, we should pull back and let the world figure it out by itself. That's where we seem to have gotten a lot of the problems. And then, on the other hand, when we did try to do it, we bungled it.
if I could just say a word in response to this gentleman's question. I think the fundamental difference I have with you is I think that there was no way we could do social engineering in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan and have a happy ending. It's just impossible to do, mainly because of nationalism, but because of other factors as well. But there are a lot of people like you who believe, right, that we just did it wrong. And that's why I fear in 20 years from now, if the United States reemerges as a unipole, people like you will think we can do it again. In other words, we can pursue liberal hegemony again. We'll just do it right this time. We did it wrong the last time. And I disagree with that.
No, I'm just saying, if you have a military occupation, you actually have to execute a military occupation and occupy the country. And Japan, the Dominican Republic, multiple other examples throughout the post-World War II, we did so in a way, when I was in Iraq during the surge, we still were acting like it was an expeditionary moment. And that was 5 years into it. We were refusing to pave the roads in the base that we were occupying because we were going to pull out in any moment. And you can't have a transformative colonial project, basically, and if that's a decision that the politicians make, which I disagree with, I think it was a strategic blunder. But if you're going to execute a colonial project, you have to do it properly. And they chose to do it on the cheap, as you said.
Well, again, part of my argument is that you have to sort of pretend that these things aren't going to be expensive or you won't do them at all. It seems to me if George Bush had been told, look, you're going to have to put 600,000 troops there and you're going to have to leave them there for at least 25 years, and it's going to cost you however many $1 trillion to pull this project off, right? He would never have done it, right? And if he put that to the American people, do you want to do this in Iraq and here's what it's going to cost, our best estimate, the American people would not have supported it, and of course he knew that as well. They had to fool themselves into thinking it would be cheap.
Can I ask you on this front, please, whether you see Kosovo and Balkans from the perspective of 1999 to today as a successful example of liberal exercise of liberal hegemony compared to the alternative of not intervening? Is that a counterexample of success?
is like the weakest possible success you could point to. If you look at the condition of the Balkan states now, they continue to be.
But compared to what?
No, I think it would have been a matter of strategic and political indifference to us.
Okay. If there was a conflagration.
Baker was right.
If there was a conflagration in the Balkans.
Conflagration.
You know, if there were massive human rights abuses and
There were, I don't know if you want to call them that, there were very large-scale human rights abuses
that were
there.
checked.
Right, they were checked, that's right. That, the extent to which it is a success, but it's hardly a success in terms of creating well-functioning institutions, and the place could still fall apart.
But shouldn't, just last question, we'll get back to it, but shouldn't we compare it to the world of what would have happened absent our massive intervention militarily and financially and organizationally and the like? I don't know the answer. I just don't know how you would cast that out.
Again, I code that, if you want to call it that, as a limited success.
That's okay.
Hello, I'm Gabriel Adobamo. I'm a local student and actually doing cybersecurity extension school. So my question is, when you guys were talking about the groupthink and sort of hive mind aspects, like with the block that made similar decisions because they wanted to stay in the block, I've heard many ideas of like that of various natural and especially social sciences. You want to keep your tenure, you want to be published, so you speak to similar things like that at the block. So the question is, what's the difference between that groupthink and block thinking in general sciences and what you're talking about here? What's new here?
Well, it's certainly a big theme, at least in my book, is the sort of, call it groupthink, the very pronounced consensus or narrow range of opinion across both political parties inside the foreign policy elite. One of the ways I try to show that or illustrate it is by looking at three reasonably well-known task force reports. One was the so-called Princeton Project on National Security, which came out in 2006. Then there was something called the Project for a United and Strong America in 2013. And then the Center for New American Security put out something called, I think, Extending American Power in 2016. These are bipartisan exercises. You recognize all the names of the people involved in them. And what's interesting about them, of course, is they're at three rather different periods in our history and in the condition of the world. One of them, before Iraq has really gone south and before the financial crisis, that's the Princeton Project. The other one's subsequently, and one right at the end of Obama as we're heading towards Trump. And they're interchangeable. You read the three of them, they say exactly the same things. They are ringing endorsements of liberal hegemony. So it kind of doesn't matter what the condition of the world is, what the condition of the American economy is, what public opinion is, the answer is always the same, right? The other little footnote I would put to this, and by the way, this is not unique to the foreign policy elite. There are other places where I think you would find similar congruities of opinion, people understanding that there's sort of an acceptable consensus, because in this world, as in some other worlds, your reputation really does matter. And as the Elizabeth Warren quote I read suggests, knowledgeable Washington insiders like Larry Summers understand that if you go outside, you may be fine, you may have a safe job, you may have tenure, thank goodness, but it's going to limit your potential to rise and be a real player in that world, because you'll get the reputation of being, not sound, kind of the wrong ideas, possibly dangerous, etc.
But I want to emphasize that I have a different argument than Steve does, as I laid it out here. And my argument is that the United States is a fundamentally liberal country. This is the sort of Louis Hart's view. For those of you who haven't read his famous book from 1955, he was a Harvard professor back in the day. It's called The Liberal Tradition in America. And Hart's argument is that the United States is so liberal, it's illiberal in the sense that it doesn't tolerate someone who doesn't fit in the mode of the liberal. And we're using liberal in a very broad sense here. This is Kathryn's problem with calling neoconservatives liberal. We're talking about liberals in the Lockean sense of the term. And it's that liberalism coupled with American nationalism. I can't emphasize this point enough. It's not just liberalism that drives us all over the planet. It's nationalism as well. Remember what I said about Madeleine Albright? I was describing her. I mean, she is certainly a liberal, but she's also a nationalist. We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller. We see further. When you marry that mentality, that nationalism, with liberal fervor, as evidenced in liberal hegemony, you're off to the races. And this is why I said, Kathryn, it's so hard for people like us, liberals and realists, to keep these folks in check.
Well, and just as a footnote, gets back to the very first comment that was made. If you go back to the Iraq War, and this isn't just about the Iraq War, but there were the so-called, liberal hawks, the people who supported the war not for weapons of mass destruction reasons. People like my good friend Michael Ignatieff, right, who actually blurred the book. A nice man that he is, but he supported the Iraq War for human rights reasons, because Saddam Hussein was a vicious tyrant who deserved to be overthrown and replaced with something better. Right? So, that is part of this coalition as well, and makes it much harder to be more than, as John put it, speed bumps.
Hello, my name is Zoltan Feher. I'm a graduate of this school, a student of Professor Nye and Professor Walt. I'm pursuing my PhD at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I'm working on U.S. grand strategy. My question concerns the cost of U.S. retrenchment. So the main counter-argument to the restraint camp or the retrenchment camp from the proponents of deep engagement or liberal hegemony is that it's going to cost the U.S. dearly. The U.S. is going to cost to U.S. primacy. The U.S. is going to lose economically, politically, in its influence. Let's say that the Washington Bloc comes to its senses, or structural realists take over Washington, and there's a U.S. policy of retrenchment from tomorrow. Do you think there would be a cost to U.S. prosperity and security?
No.
The opposite. Would the U.S. lose anything if it retrenched from its global engagement?
Well, you would have to define. I mean, this is such an open-ended question. Neither one of us is interested in retrenching in East Asia. We believe it's imperative for the United States to contain China, right? I think both of us believe that the United States should retrench in Europe, that we should not be protecting Europeans. The Europeans are perfectly capable of protecting themselves against whatever threat is out there. So it just depends. But we're not making arguments where we think the United States is going to weaken itself. We'd be crazy to make that kind of argument. So, some sort of retrenchment here and there is necessary. And our basic argument is that you want to avoid trying to spread liberal democracy at the end of a rifle barrel all over the planet.
I would just add, if you think that the United States and China are destined, if not for war, at least for a significant security competition, then the one thing you would wish if you were a Chinese grand strategist is for the United States to keep doing pretty much what it's been doing for the last 20 or 25 years. If you were interested in balancing China, boy, I would like to have spent a lot more time nurturing relationships in Asia, and I would like that several $1 trillion back, because I could either use it to build infrastructure at home, I could use it to build weaponry if I felt I needed it, I could use it, I could leave it in the taxpayers' pockets, I could do a lot of really good long-term things. So in some respects, American grand strategy for the past 25 years has been an enormous gift to Beijing if you think that that's really the problem we face. I had one other point about this, there's a line now you hear from people like Hal Brands and others that look at the things that are happening in the Middle East now, because the United States is retrenching from the Middle East, and now we're getting all this misbehavior. Most recently, the appears to be murder of a dissident Saudi journalist, and that's because the United States is no longer minding the store, and the jungle is growing back, Bob Kagan's new book. That's not what's happening at all. The United States hasn't withdrawn from the Middle East. We're still actively involved there. And what we've done is double down on all of our security commitments and other political engagements. We've been giving the Saudis and the Israelis and the Gulfies and the Egyptians a blank check. Do whatever you want. right? And we'll back you up no matter what. And then the Saudis feel like they can go murder a journalist. Maybe if they had a little bit more doubts about whether or not the United States was going to back them to the hilt, they would ask twice before they did something like that.
Thank you. May I have a
We don't-
small follow-up?
I think we need to let others ask. I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the rewarding discussion. I'm an MPID student here. I'm from Russia. So I'm definitely feeling sort of on my skin this consensus that Russia is bad. And I think what's interesting is that the consensus is not just Russian government is bad or is doing bad things, but Russia is bad. And in my personal, not so grand and not so strategic strategy was to just be hoping that, well, I'm young enough to hopefully see a different equilibrium at some point, in our lives. But then I'm thinking, well, this consensus might as well outlive our current leaders, because this consensus outlived already the Cold War. And in a lot of ways you can think, well, this lack of trust, of Americans not expanding NATO and Russians feeling that well, expansion of NATO must mean a threat to Russia was the reason we are where we are now. So how do you think, is there anything we could be doing now to make sure this consensus at some point is, dismissed? Or are we gonna be destined to have Cold War III, IV, and etc., even though we have hopefully some leadership change and foreign policy change?
Well, I think it's fair to say that both Steve and I are not part of the consensus in the United States that is profoundly anti-Russian. But with regard to the question of whether or not that's likely to change in the future, I think the answer is no. And my view is the only way it will change is if China continues to rise and the United States feels that it needs the Russians as part of a balancing coalition against China. Then we'll make nice with the Russians, just as we made nice with the Soviets in the early 1940s, because it was imperative to balance with them against Nazi Germany. But I think absence of a need to work with the Russians against China, relations with the Russians will be as bad as they are today, 10 years from now.
Can I make 3 points on that? One is that this reminds us that it's not just trying to spread democracy in a rifle barrel that can be a problem. We weren't trying to spread democracy in Eastern Europe with a rifle barrel, really. We were doing it peacefully. We were extending security guarantees and things like that. And that still was alarming to Russia, rightly or wrongly. So second, as John just implied, actually a better relationship with Russia, it would be in everybody's interest. It would be in Europe's interest to have the Russians not meddling in Ukraine, threatening the Baltic states, possibly doing some other stuff. It'd be good for Europe. It would be good for Russia if to get the sanctions lifted and not to worry about further expansion eastward of NATO. And it would be good for the United States to try and pull Beijing and Moscow further apart, get some distance there. And you could even argue that Donald Trump kind of intuited that, right? That was part of what he ran on, that he would do a better relationship. But of course, because Trump has so badly entangled himself with Russia in ways that we're still trying to figure out, he's now politically incapable of doing something that would be in Europe's interest, Russia's interest, and America's interest, which is really unfortunate in some respects. And it probably speaks to Jack's question about the rationality of politics.
Thanks.
Cole Harrison, Mass Peace Action. My concern is that the foreign policy that the United States is pursuing with liberal hegemony is not in the interests of the majority of the American people. Yes, there's this runaway blob that's doing its own thing, but I think it's not just it's leading away from the interests of the American people. Just the cost of the war, the $6 trillion wasted in the Middle East wars, that's one level of it, but it's also that it's an empire. It drives the blob crazy. It drives Washington crazy when any country tries to rebel against the overall system. That's what drives them so crazy about Iran, Russia, Venezuela. Any country, it doesn't matter what its social system is, that doesn't want to stick with that overall production system has to be brought back in. And that seems to be the thread that pulls American foreign policy together. I always like to use this example. This is my iPhone. parts of it were made in 50 different countries, and the same model is sold in 150 different countries. So there's an economic system there that's Washington has a huge part in sustaining, and our foreign policy is a huge part of sustaining. So our people are left behind. Their masters are kind of running around looking at the whole world, and they're just looking at one country. So that's not in the interests of our people. And okay, so in terms of this American exceptionalism, that's the ideology. It's nationalism, but it's an ideology that the American nationalism is the nationalism of the world. And that's all.
I just want to say a word about the disconnect between the elites on one hand and the public on the other hand. Steve made it very clear that the last 4 presidents have all run against the existing foreign policy and got elected. But yet, nothing changed except for maybe in the case of Donald Trump. So the question is, what explains this disconnect? First of all, I think the American public does not care much about foreign policy. And they do not care much about foreign policy in large part because the United States is the most secure great power in the history of the world. We're separated from all our principal adversaries by 2 giant moats. We have thousands of nuclear weapons. And during the period from 1989 up to recently, we were the unipole, the sole pole of the system, which by definition means we had no great power competitors. Does it get any better than this? The American people intuit this, and this is why they don't care that much about foreign policy, because they don't feel threatened, because they are not threatened. And this, of course, is why the elite has to engage
They're threatened economically by American foreign policy.
But this gets to my second point, okay? As long as large numbers of Americans are not dying, and you have this all-volunteer force that's equipped with the technology that Jack was talking about, right, and can defer the costs of the war to the future, that's getting to your point, this can go on for a really long time, as it has.
As it has.
Yes.
Next question.
I'm Matt Spebinger. I'm an assistant professor at the business school, and I wanted to follow up with this question of public opinion, because if I'm hearing each of you correctly, I think I sense a little bit of a disagreement. Professor Walt seemed to characterize public opinion as somewhat of a font of enduring wisdom. American public opinion, in his mind, seems to be anti-interventionist, perhaps a little bit skeptical of globalization, whereas Professor Mearsheimer is characterizing the American people, at least in his prepared remarks, as kind of parochial, know-nothing nationalists who want to remake the world in their own image. And so my question concerns the kind of going forward, what do we need for a more effective foreign policy? Do we need to indulge public opinion, or do we need to insulate foreign policy from public opinion? Do we need a more small d democratic or a less small d democratic public opinion in order to act more effectively in the world?
That's a great question. Just to be clear, I was mostly trying to describe what I characterize as this gap between what the elite believes and wants, and it's both in terms of sort of big issues like how engaged we should be and things like that. And you also see it in specifics, like should we send more troops to Afghanistan, should we intervene in Syria, things like that. Where there's just clear difference just between what people who identify as the elite or who you would label as being an elite or who are members of the Council on Foreign Relations or whatever, and what the American people want. That doesn't necessarily mean that the American public is right all the time, right? There may be some times where the elite actually sees the problem correctly and prescribes the right solution, etc. And the public has to be brought along that way. I was just documenting that there's a gap between what the American people say they want pretty consistently over time. But of course, saying you want that in response to a poll is different than actively engaging politically to try and change it. And there I do agree with John. On most issues, unless there's a real train wreck someplace, the American people don't weigh in a big way. And all of the things that the elite has now done, a lot of the practices they've adopted are designed to keep them as quiet as possible. Also, make sure that they're fed a sort of steady diet of information that supports whatever it is we're doing. And there's a whole story there in the book, too.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. I didn't try to disparage the American public. But your comment does raise a point that is worth considering here. The American people are very nationalistic. patriotic is the word that we usually use, and there's not a lot of difference in my lexicon between those two words. And I believe that this is something that Donald Trump understood, and I believe when you run an America First campaign, you are going to have a lot of cachet with a huge swath of the American public. And I think if the Democrats want to get back in the business of winning presidential elections, right, they're going to have to play the nationalism card much more so in the future. The other point I would make is if you think about universities, I spent a lot of time thinking about this because I don't consider myself a nationalist, despite the fact that I write about nationalism and make this argument that it's such a powerful force. Universities are incredibly international in nature. They're not nationalistic at all. And it's really what makes them quite wonderful. It's another way of saying they're very liberal. I don't discriminate among students in terms of where they came from. If somebody from the Czech Republic is smarter than an American, I'll hire the Czech person over the American any day, right? But this is very much at odds with the way, most Americans think. I remember there was a Yale a Yale dean who said that here at Yale, what we want to do is have a student body that's 15% international because we're interested in training the leaders of the world. And I said when I gave a talk last fall at Yale, it's lucky that Donald Trump did not see that comment by that dean, because he would have played on it from a nationalist point of view, and he would have benefited greatly from it.
Could I just ask you
Sure.
here? So we're talking now about what elected Donald Trump, and I don't think we completely know, but there's an assumption here that our failures in foreign policy elected Donald Trump.
Helped.
Okay, but I want to suggest just another hypothesis, okay, and that is the 40% of the eligible voters in this country who didn't vote in 2016, okay? And some of those eligible voters were people who believed what you guys just said in these books, and that there's no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. And that belief that there's no difference between the Republicans kept people, I think young people, kept progressive people away from the polls. Okay, so there's a dilemma here, isn't it? Saying, George Bush, Obama, all the same. Whether we encourage that notion that why should anyone vote because the Democrats in the midterms coming up because the Democrats and Republicans are just the same. Okay, so
On foreign policy.
Yeah. There are differences between the two parties. I would just a couple things. We haven't talked about Bernie Sanders. I mean, Bernie Sanders, a socialist, self-proclaimed socialist from Vermont, one of the two least popular senators in the Senate. Right, the other one is Ted Cruz, by the way. Right, runs a campaign for president, does remarkably well. And one of the things is that he's, of course, very critical of our very interventionist foreign policy. So you have to add to Trump all of the people who were Sanders supporters, some of whom did, in fact, stay home as well. And one thing to speculate on, I wrote a column for Foreign Policy about this, is whether or not there is a potential foreign policy coalition between three groups that don't agree on a lot of other things. But I would call it the sort of non-interventionist progressives, kind of the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, not the Hillary Clinton wing, because Hillary's always been a big hawk. The Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, right, the sort of realists like John and me, and then libertarians, right, who also believe in non-intervention because they like a small government, like small defense. Now, these three groups don't agree on a bunch of other issues, right? But could they align against the sort of liberal internationalists and neoconservatives who have run foreign policy? I have no idea if such a coalition could be assembled, what effects it would have, but it's worth sort of speculating about. My great fear is it's really hard to get people to play together when they don't agree on almost everything. It may not be possible to put that together, but it's at least fun to think about.
Hi, I'm Maeve Campbell. I'm a graduate of both the Chicago undergrad and the Kennedy School, and now work here as a research assistant. And I know today we focused a lot on liberalism in the U.S., but I was wondering if this also applies in other contexts. You look at other major world powers like a China, or like maybe a Russia of the past, or researching today, actively spreading their values, maybe not liberal values, but it seems like a lot of this is not necessarily liberalism with nationalism. Perhaps it's just country with some kind of deeply entrenched set of values that gets really powerful and therefore just wants to spread those values for nationalist reasons or whatever. So I was wondering if this is like a phenomena that is unique to the US, or if it's just like an inevitable component of human nature, or just kind of how the world order just works consistently over and over, and we'll see it again even if the US isn't the most powerful power.
My argument is that you need a universal ideology, right? And my argument is if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War and communism looked like the winning ideology, that the Soviets would have tried to spread communism all across the globe in the same way that the Americans tried to spread liberal democracy. If in 50 years China emerged as a unipole, let's just say the United States falls apart, the resurrection of Russian power ceases, and China looks in 50 years pretty much the way we looked in 1990. I do not believe that they would engage in trying to spread their political system all over the planet because they do not have a universal ideology. So what you need to make this work is you need unipolarity. You need to be so powerful you can ignore the balance of power, and then you need to have a universalistic ideology that you can then go out and try to spread. And they, by the way, would have run into the same trouble we did.
Yeah. And all I will say in the book is if you like those liberal values, and I do, and like John, I like living in a liberal society, and you think that the world would be better off if more countries subscribe to them, if the trend lines that Kathryn pointed to got even better, then the United States should concentrate on setting a good example. Among other things, demonstrating that having those values in your own country produces all sorts of wonderful benefits. People live well, people live freely, people have prosperous lives, etc. And we should focus more attention on, being the shining city on the hill, and less on trying to force feed those ideas to others at our pace rather than at theirs.
We have time for only a very, very quick question, please.
I'm from China, Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and Fulbright Scholar, hosted at Fairbanks Center. And it's my great honor to be here to audit your speech, because Professor Mearsheimer's saying on trilateral relations between China, America, and Russia is widely spread in China. And Professor Walt's writing book, Origin of Alliance, is very popular among Chinese scholars. Here, I'd like to ask you a question about why the rising China will impose challenge to the traditional IR theory. And because I'm a professor working at my school, I advise many international students, especially students from Korea, and when they select their master thesis topic, they select topic just as about Korea's missile development process and bargaining process with America. And also another topic such as dilemma of America and Korea's alliance. Because on one hand, China does provide lots of opportunity of profits and economic opportunities for Korea. And on the other hand, America seems to have security concern. And especially in Trump presidency, we know as the easing condition of Korean Peninsula, and Korea does seek more independent diplomacy to develop its national interest. So my question is whether the rising China will impose challenge to the traditional IR theory, such as origin of alliance or the alliance management, something like that. Many thanks.
Well, my view on South Korea, I'll talk about South Korea, not North Korea, which I think you were talking about, is that the South Koreans, like many countries in East Asia, are torn between China and the United States. South Koreans understand that for economic reasons, it really pays to have good relations with China. And from an economic point of view, it is certainly not in South Korea's interest to antagonize the Chinese and have the Chinese punish South Korea economically. At the same time, the South Koreans are worried about the fact that they live next door to this Godzilla. And this Godzilla may get angry at them at some point and try to quash them. And therefore, the South Koreans have very powerful incentives to form a strategic alliance with the United States, which of course in turn angers the Chinese for understandable reasons. So if you're South Korean, you're Australian, you're Vietnamese, you're Filipino, you're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, as we used to say when I was a kid, right? You don't know which way to go. And the $64,000 question is, as China continues to grow more powerful, will the South Koreans, if forced to choose, ally with the United States against China, or will they bandwagon with the Chinese? Now, as a good realist, my view is that they'll balance with the United States against China. But whenever I give a talk on this subject and make the argument I just made to you, people on the other side make what is conventionally known as the economic interdependence argument, which I'm sure you know well, which says that economic interdependence is what really matters, and the fact that Korea and China are so economically interdependent, the United States and China are so economically interdependent, means we're not going to have a serious security competition between the United States and China. And South Korea, China, and the United States can live happily ever after. I don't believe that, but that is the alternative story.
That's where
Yeah, John has nicely summarized the argument of my first book, so I won't do that. Nothing yet in Asia has led me to sort of revise my views on this, as China has grown more powerful, and especially as it has grown more assertive in trying to shift the status quo in a variety of ways. You see countries being more enthusiastic about wanting to be close to the United States, including countries like Vietnam and others who have not been close in the past. So that seems to be pretty consistent with the balance of threat ideas I laid out before. I did note, though, that if those states can't find other allies, and that a set of allies in Asia is a somewhat fragile alliance for various reasons, then the weaker and more endangered among them might be inclined to bandwagon. So the United States could screw this up, right, in a variety of ways. All the potential for a good balancing coalition is there, but if we're really bad at managing this, we could screw it up, and I would say so far the Trump administration is doing an excellent job of screwing it up.
Thank you both very much, and congratulations.